right here I have the 3 most common configurations of the MacBook. So let's figure out which one is right for you. Starting with the base model 13-inch M1 MacBook Air, you're gonna get 8 gigs of RAM, 8-core CPU, 7-core GPU, and a 16-core neural engine, as well as a 256 gig SSD and a 30-watt USB-C power adapter. This MacBook Air will cost you $1,000 US or $1,300 Canadian. Moving on, we have the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro chip. This is going to have 16 gigs of RAM with an 8-core CPU, a 14-core GPU, and a 16-core neural engine. This model includes a 512 gig SSD and a 67-watt charger that can be upgraded for $20. This is the base model of the MacBook Pro that is starting at $2,000 US or 2,500 Canadian dollars. And the final computer, we have the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max. This is fully spec'd out, so 64 gigs of RAM, a 10-core CPU, a 32-core GPU, and a 16-core neural engine. In terms of storage, I have a 1TB SSD, but you can go all the way up to 8TB. Now, with this option, the 96-watt USB-C power adapter is actually included. If you go with this configuration, it's going to be $3,700 US or 4,650 Canadian dollars. Moving on, let's take a look at the different ports. Starting with the M1 MacBook Air, there are only 2 USB-C ports and 1 3.5mm headphone jack. Now, for the most part, if you're doing basic day-to-day tasks, you won't need anything more than this. But as soon as you find yourself reaching for an SD card reader, different peripherals, or even just trying to transfer files from different drives, that's when you should look into a dongle. Looking at the MacBook Pro, the 2 MacBook Pros have the same ports, obviously because they're the same model. On the left side of the computer, there are 2 USB-C ports and a MagSafe port that is really nice to have back on these laptops. There's also a 3.5mm headphone jack that was surprisingly good, considering I was able to plug in my planar magnetic headphones without an amp and still get good results. On the opposite side, there's the last USB-C port, an HDMI port, and an SD card port. It's so nice to not need to carry around an SD card reader anymore. Now, let's take a look at the design of these laptops. So with the MacBook Pro, you're gonna notice right away that the body is the same thickness all the way through. With the MacBook Air, however, you have the tapered edge on one side, so it's a little thinner on one end. So with the MacBook Pro, the keys don't feel as mushy as they do on the MacBook Air, and I'm a really big fan of the black background on the keyboard compared to the MacBook Air that had the silver backgrounds. And the Touch ID on the MacBook Pro is a lot nicer because it's like its own button. You know, it matches the same shape and size as all the other keys. The Touch ID on the MacBook Air was a little bit small, and it was easy to kind of misplace your finger and not actually trigger the Touch ID. So on this newer MacBook Pro, it's a lot bigger and it's a lot easier to actually unlock your laptop or pop your passwords in with Touch ID. Looking at the MacBook Air, the bezels are extremely noticeable since they're pretty thick, but with the MacBook Pro, they're actually extremely thin. It's almost like they're not even there. There's also a notch, but it's not that noticeable. But one thing I did notice is when I was using Lightroom, there's this weird feature that hides the notch. It's like a little drop-down black bar that creates a fake bezel. I don't know why they did this since the notch isn't that noticeable while you're, focused on working on whatever you're doing. All right, now we're gonna be looking at the performance. So to be honest, the MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro chip and the M1 Max are very similar. It's kind of hard to distinguish the two, but the M1 Max is a little bit better when it comes to any kind of video GPU loads. In terms of testing these laptops, I pretty much just did a lot of real world testing. I did a couple of render tests just to see how fast it went in Premiere and After Effects, and just kind of scrubbing through footage and just seeing how it all feels. So the M1 Air I used for about a year, so I have a pretty good understanding of how it feels and how it works. But the 2 MacBook Pros, I didn't get to do as extensive of testing and using on a day-to-day basis. In terms of the M1 Air, scrubbing through footage on Premiere Pro is pretty good. There are times where it starts to get a little bit sluggish, but that usually only happens with 4K projects with multiple layers, color grading effects. That's when it starts to kind of crumble. But if you're doing a lot of 1080p work, the M1 Air will probably work just fine for you. Moving to the M1 Pro, it's honestly really good, scrubs through perfectly fine, can handle 4K footage really well. You can stack a couple layers and even throw on some effects. You have to render it out pretty often, but it gets the job done really well. Now for the M1 Max, 64 gigs of RAM, this thing literally scrubs through like butter, like no issues at all, almost never lag behind. And I didn't really need to render things out that often. Having 64 gigs of RAM was huge because I was able to tap between different softwares and keep working at full speed and not have to worry about anything. And I was able to watch everything back at pretty much full resolution at all times. Now in terms of export tests, I just have this short little 45-second project that I was working on. It's not finished, but I just wanted to see how long it would take to export this 4K video with a couple layers and multicam footage. So with the M1 Air, it took about 1 minute and 55 seconds. For the M1 Pro, it was 55 seconds. And for the M1 Max, it was only 44 seconds. So you can see that the M1 Pro and the M1 Max are very similar. But when you do a longer export test, that's when you start to see the difference between these two. The next test I did was an export of an 11-minute video. So the M1 Air took a whopping 52 minutes and 46 seconds. The M1 Pro took only 24 minutes and 25 seconds. And the M1 Max took 11 minutes and 23 seconds. This is pretty much half the speed of the M1 Pro. And like I said earlier, this is where you start to see the difference between the two chips. So in terms of testing in Lightroom, what I did is I loaded up a time lapse that I shot, and it was about 244 photos. To import them all, it was pretty much the same time across all three laptops. For the M1 Air, you were looking at about 36 seconds. The M1 Pro was about 32. And then the M1 Max was about 22 seconds. So the M1 Max was faster, but it's not that big of a difference overall. So after editing one photo and copy and pasting all the adjustments across all 244 photos, they're all pretty much the same again. So the M1 Air was able to do it at around 4 seconds. The M1 Pro was about 3 seconds. And the M1 Max actually took like 1 second to 2 seconds maximum. It was so fast, I didn't even get a chance to time it. The real difference really showed up when I started to export all of these photos. So in terms of the export speeds, the M1 Pro and the M1 Max were very similar. I did notice something a little weird though, and I'll get into that in a few seconds. So to export all 244 photos, the M1 Air took 23 minutes. So you might be like, hey, that's not that bad. 244 photos, that's a lot. But the M1 Pro and the M1 Max both took about 3 minutes and 46 seconds. That's crazy. So here's the little weird thing that I noticed, and I'm not sure exactly what it is. I have heard that the 14-inch does throttle, so it might be that. I know that during the majority of the export for the M1 Max, it was running at about 90%. But when the M1 Max got to the end of the export, it was running at about 40%. So I think there might be some kind of throttling or something going on at that point. That's pretty much it for the Lightroom section. So obviously they're all very similar except for when you're exporting. So if you're gonna be exporting a lot of photos in batches, I would highly suggest you go for the MacBook Pros over the MacBook Air. But if you're only doing like 10 to 20 photos at a time, it's probably not that big of a deal and you can live with the MacBook Air. So now After Effects, this is the beast that I've been so scared to touch for years and years because my computer has never been able to handle the footage that I shoot in After Effects. And every time I tried to do something, I kind of struggled with it because of just playback and just getting frustrated with the entire experience of it. So I was really excited to try it out and I got some pretty good results. So basically for this, I pulled up a project file from the internet. I just downloaded it and I tried out exporting it and just seeing how it scrubbed overall. So for the M1 Air, it had a hard time doing anything. So if I were to click on anything, not that responsive. So I wouldn't really recommend using After Effects. It had a pretty long frame generation time and the cache playback was pretty small. Since you only have 8 gigs of RAM, there's not much you can do there. The M1 Pro had a much better cache playback and it was able to use After Effects pretty well, even with 16 gigs of RAM. Of course, I would recommend to have 32 gigs of RAM because that's like the sweet spot. But with 16 gigs of RAM, you can get away with using After Effects pretty well. Now the M1 Max, obviously, it just blazed through everything. It was really good at exporting. It was really good at playback and just frame generation time. So overall, the M1 Max was a beast in After Effects and had a great time using it. And of course, since there's 64 gigs of RAM, it's very easy to use After Effects while using Premiere and having Photoshop open, so you can have all your apps open and running at the same time. Versus the M1 Max at 16 gigs, you're probably gonna wanna use just After Effects and then just use Premiere, and you're just gonna wanna avoid multitasking as much as possible. In terms of export time, I exported the same thing across all 3 computers, and I noticed a couple of different things. So when there was a render cache and no render cache, you had 2 different render times. So for the M1 Air with no render cache, it took about 4 minutes, 40 seconds. And if there was a pre-render, it was about 1.5 minutes. The M1 Pro with no pre-render was about 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and with the pre-render, it was 9 seconds. And the M1 Max came in at 2 minutes and 20 seconds with no pre-render, but with a pre-render, it was 6 seconds. Blazing fast, makes no sense. So RAM test, obviously 64 gigs of RAM, you can do everything at the same time. With 16 gigs of RAM, you can't be using Google Chrome, After Effects, Premiere Pro, all the stuff at the same time. With 32 gigs of RAM and swap storage, you can definitely run everything you need and have a pretty good experience. So 64 is probably overkill, but for me, I like to have as much room as I can to work with. Who is the M1 Air for? I would definitely say if you're a general user with light photo and video editing, you're good to go with the M1 Air. I would suggest either a RAM upgrade or SSD upgrade because 256 gigs is not that much, especially if you're downloading creative apps. Those will fill up your storage quite a bit since you want to keep at least 30% of your SSD free so you don't bog your computer down too much. Now for the MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro chip, this is very good for any kind of photographer or anyone doing light to intermediate video work. So with 16 gigs of RAM, you'll be able to get by without multitasking too much. But if you do multitask and want to multitask, 32 gigs of RAM is the sweet spot for you. And for the MacBook Pro with the M1 Max chip, it's really for someone that wants the best and literally never have to worry about their specs holding them back from what they're creating or doing on their computer. So this is really gonna be for people that are way more focused into video work, rendering things, 3D work. This is what you're gonna wanna get. 64 gigs of RAM is a little bit of overkill. You can most likely get by with 32 gigs, but if you do have the extra cash lying around, I would definitely suggest going for the 64 gigs of RAM just because you're never gonna dip into any kind of memory pressure issues. For me, I was like, I'm already spending about $4,000. I might as well spend the extra little bit and fully deck this thing out. So I hope this video was helpful, and if you have any other comparisons that you wanna see, leave a comment down below. And make sure to like and subscribe because it does help with the algorithm and it helps me to make more of these videos because they take a lot of work to put together.